the touch of your lips, dear, but much more for the touch of your whips, dear. You can raise welts like nobody else as we dance to the masochism tango.
Hey everybody, this is Hourgasm. This is the podcast where we talk about decolonizing sexuality and gender. I am Lynsey G. I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I'm also pretty cool with they, them, and theirs pronouns.
And I am Lenny Peppers. I use she, her, and hers pronouns.
And on this episode of Hourgasm, we are going to talk about Mawwiage. I absolutely don't think that I can say the word in an official context without saying it like the guy on The Princess Bride. So I apologize. Yeah. Anyone who's younger than me and doesn't know what the hell I'm talking about. And I apologize to everyone who does know what I'm talking about because it's such an obvious joke, but it's just, I can't help it. It's my programming. So Mawwiage is what brings us here together today. And I also apologize for anyone that I just offended by doing a really bad speech impediment, but it already happened and I can't change it. So here we are. So I don't know, marriage is kind of like the whole thing of more or less the patriarchy and the colonization of our romantic and erotic relationships, you know, as a species.
I've been through it twice, and I have to say that there are like days that I go through where I'm like incredibly angry that we have been tricked into believing like in the concept and practice of normative middle-class nuclear family, including heteronormative coupledom as like the correct way to love.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's the default for like what love is supposed to be. And the thing that makes me so angry about that is that like the actual like act of marriage itself really doesn't have anything to do with love or romance or any of that. I feel like I was gaslit into getting married the first time. Like my entire life, like I was told that that's what I was supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And then I did, and it was awful. And then I did it again and it was okay. So, but I mean, it's just, I don't know. It makes me so angry though, that like, that's what, even like growing up on a reservation where that kind of nuclear family relationship isn't like true for Indigenous people and the way that we see relationships. So.
Oh man, there's so much right there. Like, I kind of just want to let you talk for a while because I'm over here like, oh my God, yes, preach. Like, tell me more. But just so that like we're on a little bit of like even footing going in, I guess like talking about our personal feelings about marriage. I have very similar feelings about it. I was raised in the dominant culture of America, which, as we have discussed, is very much related to Disney films, which is very much tied into, the Grimm brothers and Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales, which is very much tied into European ideas of, how people are supposed to behave with regards to sex and gender. And like, I was definitely raised with this idea that for women, the finding your prince, aka getting married, is your happily ever after. Like, that's it. That's the end of your story, is when you get married, and that's the thing that you want to happen because it's a happy ending. But like, that always just felt so incomplete to me, because like, you're encouraged to get married, around the time you're like 20, I guess, pretty average in like the popular culture, the way that it's displayed, especially like in Disney movies. And like, you're just, then what? Like, that's not an ending, that's a beginning. But it's funny because like, I think when I was a kid, I don't ever remember like fantasizing about my own marriage. Like, I never got swept away by thoughts of like, oh, what's my wedding dress gonna look like, or anything like that. I had like no personal stake in it. But at the same time, I understood that weddings were like a big deal. And therefore, like, I would always marry like my toys. Or like, if I was bored at dinner and I didn't feel like eating, I would like marry my fork and my spoon. Like, so I was always performing weddings, but I never put myself into the role of one of the items getting married. Which I
Yeah.
think probably is also a insight into my queerness. Like I had no concept that people of the same gender could possibly be in a relationship like that. Maybe if I had, I would have seen myself more in a wedding situation. I don't know, but it never felt personal to me. And I think that, like, continuing on in my life, I've never put much value on the idea of being married as opposed to not being married. It never has felt like a priority to me personally. But I definitely have received all the same messaging that says that you're supposed to be married. That's how you be happy.
Yeah.
And I'm also really angry about that because I myself have never been married, but I have seen many people that I know and love, get married because that's what you do and
Right.
live to regret it. And yeah,
Yeah.
like you said, it like stifles people. It shoves people into this box that they may not actually want to be in, but it's just seen as like the next step. So you just do it. And especially for women, it's like, this is your day. This is your most specialist moment of your entire life that you've worked
Right.
so hard for. And then it's over and like, okay, now what?
Right. In fact, some women cling to that so hard because, as you said, it is like an ending, like for your childhood, for your life as an independent person, for like your maidenhood,
Yeah.
based on
Maidenhood.
Disney. Yeah. And so like women cling to this like so hard that they become bridezillas, and there's an entire show devoted to this
Yeah.
where they're like, this is my day, and ultimately treat like their entire like family and wedding party and friends and people that they love like crap for the sake of like going through this ceremony, which, like I said, ultimately isn't even really tied to romance or love. I had actually taken some history classes that actually spent time on what we know as the American dream. The idea of marriage is very deeply woven with what we call the American dream. And so that ultimately like started really getting like pounded into the fabric of our country, the soul of America, in just post World War II. America had created like this huge debt paying for World War II.
Okay.
And it was really, really essential to get America back on track. And they did this by creating like whole neighborhoods of houses for people to come and live in, like these like basically cookie cutter neighborhoods started springing up all over America. And if you wanted to be a part of the American dream, this is where you were supposed to go. So like the nuclear family structure in post-war America consisted of a breadwinner male and his wife, who did all of the household chores and looked after the children.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the children. Usually one boy, one girl, one dog,
Yes.
Families ate meals, they went to outings together, and they lived in these neighborhoods which were set up to be kind of like these sociable neighborhoods where you're able to go into your front yard and be a part of like the neighborhood community and still be able to go into your backyard and be a part of like your nuclear family community. The houses were literally built to do this. And then we start seeing in like post-war media, in magazines, in books, in television, and in film, we start seeing like these ideas being pushed onto Americans as like what you're supposed to do next. And so my expertise is in the study of films and television. And from this time frame, we actually, and looking into it, we actually see America point to the push of American culture towards these values And there's a specific reason for this, and it came down to what everything in the US comes down to, and that's like the bottom line.
Right. Yeah.
So marriage promoted economic advancement and social order,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which meant that people were pushed to get married younger, like marry your high school sweetheart.
Oh,
like that's
right.
a part of like the American dream, to have children. Divorces became taboo. That's when like children became like emotional rather than economic assets for the very first time in American history. And like as a whole, and like close with their parents and the center of the family. So like the father and the mother were like supposed to like have children and then like raise them to go to school and then to also sustain this like nuclear family system.
Okay.
And so because of this, parents study child development. You start seeing like a lot of like child development magazines coming through, child development books coming through around this time. And they work to socialize their children so that they would become successful adults.
Right.
And then also at this time, for the very first time in American history, is when in like colonial American history, childhood became a distinct period of life.
Right. Yeah.
Which is crazy to me because from my understanding, childhood was a distinct period of life for Native Americans for a very, very long time until this idea started being pushed on us. And so the goal of this, like I said, was the American dream or security. The American dream is security. And security for America ultimately means the bottom line.
Yeah, it means having money. It's also interesting to note, like, you're talking about post-war America sort of like setting up all of these concepts and making them mainstream for the first time. And I mean, that period was directly before the period where we saw the rise of being a teenager as a thing, like as its own distinct life period, meaning that basically like the kids who were born at the beginning of this time period then became teenagers and decided that they needed to have their own distinct life phase that they were in, you know, between childhood and adulthood. And that's when like Rebel Without a Cause happened and rock and roll music became popular.
Totally.
Oh my God, I just did rock and roll music. I'm so old. The rockin' and the rollin' music makes me nervous.
We start seeing something in film and television around this same time. It's called the teenage gaze. And that's where we start seeing like what the world looks like from like the teenager's eyes.
It's pretty much Twilight, right? That's what the teenage gaze is.
Kind of. I mean, think back to the 1980s with Fred Savage in Wonder Years.
Yeah.
Looking back on his like childhood and mostly like his teen years, that like American like 1950s nostalgia was kind of created through like all of these different kinds of media.
Right, yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too, because I'm definitely thinking about like before this time period, it kind of feels like the nuclear family option was really only for the wealthy, but that was still really mitigated by like the presence of like nurses and nannies and like sending your child away to, you know, fancy pants boarding school. And like I feel like for the very wealthy in earlier time periods in America, childhood may have been more of a distinct life phase, but it was not really, it wasn't as closely tied to the parents emotionally.
I can totally see that, but I also see like the sending of children away to like, I mean, as a Native American, like we didn't send our children away to boarding schools. They were taken away from us and put into boarding schools.
Yeah, it's very different.
It was for the purpose of like making them into people who could work for the upper class societies, essentially. And